close to Elaine. Something happened just before you returned. I was asking Samiko if she'd heal me before you got back, and she suddenly fell over in a faint. Her eyes just rolled up in her head, and down she went. It isn't only her. Nobody will admit a flaming thing, not to me, but the other kin I've seen have been jumping out of their bloody skins, and the windfinders too. Not one of them could spit if she had to. You were back before I could find the sister, but I suspect they'd give me the fish eye too. They'll tell you, though. The palace required the population of a large village to keep running, and servants had begun to appear, liveried men and women scurrying along the corridors, flattening themselves against the wall or ducking into crossing hallways to make room for Elaine's escort. So she explained the little she knew in as soft a voice and as few words as possible. Some rumors she did not mind reaching the streets and inevitably our
Hey,
neighbors,
Fire, how you
but tales
doing?
of Rand could be as bad
Hey,
as tales of the
Shosh.
Forsaken by the time they were twisted through a few retellings. Worse in a way. No one would believe the Forsaken were trying to put her on the throne as a puppet. In any event, she finished, it's nothing to do with us here. She thought she sounded very convincing, very cool and detached, but Avienda reached out
Hope
to
both y'all
squeeze her
doing good
hand
today.
for an Aiel as much as a comforting hug with so many people to see, and Birgitta's sympathy flooded through the bond. It was more than commiseration. It was the shared feeling of a woman who had already suffered the loss
Oh
she
shit,
herself
that
feared
sucks.
and more.
Hope you stay
Dido
warm, bro.
Kane was lost to Brigitte as surely as if he were dead, and on top of that, her memories of her past lives were fading. She remembered almost nothing clearly before the founding of the White Tower, and not all of that. Some nights the fear that Guido would fade from her memory too, that she would lose any remembrance of actually having known and loved him, left her unable to sleep until she drank as much brandy as she could hold. That was a poor solution, and Elaine wished she could offer a better. Yet she knew her own memories of Rand would not die until she did, and she could not imagine the horror of knowing those memories might leave her. Still, she hoped someone healed Birgitta's morning after head soon before her own split open like an overripe melon. Her ability with healing fell short of the task, and Avienda's was no stronger. Despite the emotion she could feel in Birgitta, the other woman kept her face smooth and unconcerned.
Alright, definitely hope
For
you're able to
heaven's
stay
sake,
warm.
she muttered dryly, and softly. That was not a name to bandy about. Well, as long as it had nothing to do with us, we're bloody all right. A grunt that might have been a laugh gave her the lie. But then, although Brigitte said she had never been a soldier before, she had a soldier's view. Long odds were usually the only odds you could find, but you still had to get the job done. I wonder what they think of it, she added, nodding toward the four Aes Sedai who had just stepped out of a crossing corridor down the hallway. Van Deen, Marililla, Sarita, and Cariana had their heads together as they walked, or rather, the last three were clustered around Van Deen, leaning toward her and talking with urgent gestures that made the fringes on their shawls sway. Van Deen glided along slowly as if she were alone, paying no heed. She'd always been slender, but her dark green dress, embroidered with flowers on the sleeves and shoulders, hung on her as though made for a stouter woman, and the white hair gathered at the nape of her neck seemed in need of a brush. Her expression was bleak, but that might have had nothing to do with whatever the other sisters were saying. She had been joyless ever since her sister's murder. Elaine would have wagered that dress had belonged to Adelius. Since the murder, Van Dien wore her sister's clothes more often than her own. Not that that accounted for the fit. The two women had been of a size, but Van Dien's appetite for food had died with her sister. Her taste for most things seemed to have died then. Saritha, a brown whose dark, square face was not yet touched with agelessness, saw Elaine just then, and put a hand on Van Dien's arm as if to draw her up the corridor. Van Dien brushed the Tyran woman's hand away and glided on with the merest glance at Elaine, disappearing on along the hallway they had come out of. Two women in novice white, who had been following the others at a respectful distance, offered quick curtsies to the remaining sisters, and hastened after Vandine. Marililla, a tiny woman in dark gray that made her Kyrianan paleness seem like ivory, stared as if she might follow. Ariana adjusted her green-fringed shawl on shoulders wider than those of many men and exchanged quiet words with Sarita. The pair of them turned to meet Elaine as she approached, making her curtsies almost as deep as the novices had given them. Marililla noticed the guardswoman and blinked, then noticed Elaine and gave a start. Her curtsy matched the novice's. Marililla had worn the shawl for over 100 years, Ariana for more than 50, and even Sarita had worn it longer than Elaine Tracan. But standing among Aes Sedai went to its strength in the power, and none of these three was more than middling strong among sisters. In Aes Sedai eyes, increased strength gave, if not increased wisdom, at least increased weight to your opinions. With a sufficient gap, those opinions became commands. Sometimes Elaine thought the king's way was better. I don't know what it is, she said, before any of the other Aes Sedai could speak. But there is nothing we can do about it, so we might as well quit worrying. We have enough right in front of us without fretting over things we can't affect. Rosaria half turned her head, frowning and plainly wondering what she had missed. But the words smoothed the anxiety from Sarita's dark eyes. Perhaps not from the rest of her, since her hands moved as if she wanted to smooth her brown skirts. Yet she was willing to follow the lead of a sister who stood as high as Elaine. Sometimes there were advantages to standing high enough that you could quell objections with a sentence. Ariana had already regained serenity, if she had ever lost it. It sat easily on her, though she looked more like a wagon driver than an Aes Sedai, despite her barrel-slashed silks and smooth, ageless, coppery face. But then, greens usually were made of tougher stuff than browns. Marililla did not look at all serene. Wide eyes and half-parted lips gave her the appearance of startlement. That was usual for her, though. Elaine continued along the hallway, hoping they would go about their business, but Marililla fell in beside Brigitta. The Grey should have taken primacy among the three, but she had developed a tendency to wait for someone to tell her what to do, and she shifted over without a word when Sarita politely asked Brigitta to give her room. The sisters were unfailingly courteous to Elaine's warder when she was acting as Captain General. It was Brigitta as warder they tried to ignore. Avienda received no such civility from Cariana, who elbowed in between her and Elaine. Anyone not trained in the White Tower was a wilder by definition, and Cariana despised wilders. Avienda pursed her lips, though she did not draw her belt knife or even suggest that she might, for which Elaine was grateful. Her first sister could be precipitate at times. On second thought, she would have forgiven a little hastiness from Avienda right then. Custom forbade rudeness toward another Aes Sedai under any circumstances, but Avienda could have growled threats and waved her knife to her heart's content. That might have been enough to make the threesome leave, even if in a tizzy. Cariana did not seem to notice the cool green gaze marking her. I told Marililla and Sarita it was nothing we could do anything about, she said calmly. But shouldn't we be ready to flee if it comes closer? There's no shame flying from that. Even linked, we would be moths fighting a forest fire. Van Deen wouldn't bother to listen. We really should make some sort of preparation, Elaine, Sarita murmured absently, as if making lists in her head. It's when you don't make plans and you wish you had. There are a number of volumes in the library here that mustn't be left behind. I believe several can't be found in the Tower Library. Yes. Marilla's voice was breathless, and as anxious as her large dark eyes. Yes, we really should really go. Perhaps we should not wait. Surely going from necessity would not violate our agreement. I'm sure it would not. Only Brigitta as much as glanced at her, but she flinched. If we do go, Ariana said, as if Marilla had not spoken, we'll have to take all of the kin with us. Allow them to scatter, and the light only knows what they'll do or when we will ever catch them again. especially now that some had learned to travel. There was no bitterness in her voice, though only Elaine among the sisters in the palace could travel. It seemed to make a difference to Cariana that the kinswomen had begun in the White Tower, even if most had been put out and a few had run away. She had identified no fewer than 4 of them herself, including one runaway. At least they were not wilders. Saritha's mouth tightened, though. It weighed on her that several kinswomen could weave gateways, and she had very different notions of the kin. Normally she limited her objections to the occasional frown or disparaging grimace, since Elaine had made her own views clear, but the stress of the morning seemed to have loosened her tongue. "We do indeed need to take them with us," she said in a cutting tone, "else they'll all be claiming to be Aes Sedai as soon as they're out of our sight. Any woman who maintains she was put out of the tower over 300 years ago will claim anything. They need to be kept under a close watch, if you ask me, instead of going about as they please, most especially those who can travel. They may have gone where you told them and come back so far, Elaine, but how long before one of them doesn't return? Mark my words. Once one of them escapes, others will follow, and we will have a mess on our hands we'll never clean up." "There is no reason for us to go anywhere," Elaine said firmly, as much for the guards as for their sisters. That distant beacon was still in the same spot where she had first sensed it, and if it did move, the chance seemed small that it would move toward Camelin, much less actually come there. But a rumor that Aes Sedai were planning flight might be enough to engender a stampede, mobs clawing to reach the gates ahead of whatever could frighten Aes Sedai. An army sacking the city would not kill as many. And these 3 chattered away as if there were no one to hear but the wall hangings. There was some excuse for Marillilla, but not the others. "We will remain here as the Amarlin seat has commanded until the Amarlin commands otherwise. The kinswomen will continue to receive every courtesy until they are welcomed back into the tower, and that is the Amarlin's command too, as you very well know. And you will continue teaching the Windfinders and go about your lives as Aes Sedai should. We are supposed to deal with people's fears and soothe them, not spread senseless gossip and panic." Well, perhaps she had been a touch more than firm. Saritha put her gaze on the floor tiles like a rebuked novice. Marillilla flinched again at mention of the Windfinders, but that was to be expected. The others gave lessons, but the sea folk held Marillilla as tightly as they did one of their apprentices. She slept in their quarters and normally was not seen without 2 or 3 of them, and her trailing meekly at their heels. They refused to accept anything less than meekness from her. "Of course, Elaine," Cariana said hastily. "Of course. None of us would suggest disobeying the Amarlin." Hesitating, she adjusted her green-fringed shawl over her arms, seemingly occupied with setting it just so. She did spare a pitying look from Marillilla. "But speaking of the sea folk, could you tell Van Deen to take her share of the lessons?" When Elaine said nothing, her voice took on an edge that would have been called sullen in anyone not Aes Sedai. "She says she's too busy with those 2 runaways, but she finds enough time to keep me talking some nights until I'm
Hell
half
yeah.
asleep.
Just gotta finish
That
rolling
hair is
one up.
already so cowed they wouldn't squeak if their dresses caught fire. They don't need her attention. She could take her portion of teaching those cursed wilders. Van Deen needs to start behaving as an Aes Sedai, too." Standing or no, rebuke or no, she gave Elaine a baleful glare that took her a moment to smother. Elaine had been the one who made the bargain that led to Aes Sedai having to teach Windfinders, but so far she herself had managed to miss giving more than a handful of lessons, claiming the press of other more important duties. Besides, the sea folk saw a shore-bound teacher as a hireling, even an Aes Sedai, and a hireling with less standing than a scullion at that. A scullion who might try to cheat on her neighbor. She still thought Nynaeve had gone away just to avoid giving those lessons. Certainly no one expected to end up in Marililla's state, but even a few hours at a time was bad enough. "Oh no, Cariana," Saritha put in, still avoiding Elaine's eye, and Marililla's. In her opinion, the Grey had gotten herself into this fix and thus deserved what came of it, but she did try not to rub salt in the wounds. "Van Deen is distraught over her sister. and Christian and Zarya help her occupy her mind. Whatever she thought of the other kin, she accepted that Zarya was a runaway, as she had to, since Zarya was one of those Cariana had recognized, and if Christian must be a liar, her own lie would make her pay in full for that. Runaways were not treated kindly. I spend hours with her too, and she almost never talks of anything but Adelius. It's as if she wants to add my memories to her own. I think she needs to be allowed as much time as she needs, and those two keep her from being alone too often. Giving Elaine a sidelong glance, she drew breath. Still, teaching the Windfinders is certainly challenging. Perhaps an hour now and then would help pull her out of despondency, if only by making her angry. Don't you agree, Elaine? Just an hour or two now and then? Van Deen will be allowed as much time to grieve for her sister as she needs or wants, Elaine said in level tones, and there will be no more discussion of it. Cariana sighed heavily and rearranged her shawl again. Saritha sighed faintly and began twisting the great serpent ring on the forefinger of her left hand. Perhaps they had sensed her mood, or perhaps it was just that neither looked forward to another session with the Windfinders. Marililla's permanently surprised expression did not change, but then her sessions with the sea folk lasted all day and all night, unless Elaine managed to pry her away, and the Windfinders were becoming less and less willing to let her go, no matter how Elaine pried. At least she had managed to avoid being curt with the three. It took an effort, especially with Avienda there. Elaine did not know what she would do if she ever lost her sister. Van Deen was not only grieving for a sister, she was searching for Adelius's murderer, and there could be no doubt that the killer was Marililla Devon, Cariana Francie, or Saritha Tamaras. One of them, or worse, more than one. The charge was hard to believe of Marililla in her present condition, but it was not easy to believe of any sister. As Birgitta had pointed out, one of the worst dark friends she had ever met during the Trolloc Wars was a mild-as-milk lad who jumped at loud noises and poisoned an entire city's electric supply. Avienda's suggestion was to put all three to the question, which had horrified Birgitta. But Avienda was considerably less in awe of Aes Sedai than she once had been. The proper courtesies must be maintained until there was evidence to convict. Then there would be no courtesy at all. "Oh," Saritha said, brightening suddenly. "Here's Captain Millar. He was a hero again while you were gone, Elaine." Avienda gripped the hilt of her belt knife, and Birgitta stiffened. Cariana's face went very still, very cold, and even Marililla managed a disapproving hauteur. Neither sister made any secret of her dislike for Doyle and Millar. With a narrow face, he was not pretty or even handsome, yet he moved with a swordsman's lithe grace that spoke of physical strength. As captain of Elaine's bodyguard, he rated 3 golden knots of rank, and he wore them soldered to each shoulder of his brightly burnished breastplate. An ignorant observer might have thought he outranked Birgitta. The falls of snow-white lace at his throat and wrists were twice as thick and twice as long as those worn by any of the guardsmen, but he had left off the sash again, perhaps because it would have obscured one set of golden knots. He claimed that he wanted nothing more in life than to command her bodyguard, yet he frequently talked of battles he had fought as a mercenary. It seemed he had never been on the losing side, and victory had often come from his unsung efforts on the field. He swept off his white-plumed hat in a deep, flourishing bow, managing his sword deftly with one hand, then offered a slightly lesser to Birgitta, with an arm across his chest in salute. Elaine arranged a smile on her face. "Saritha says you were a hero again, Captain Millar. How so?" "Nothing more than my duty to my queen." Despite a voice thick with self-deprecation, his answering smile was warmer than it should have been. Half the palace thought him the father of Elaine's child. That she had not crushed that rumor seemed to make him believe in his aspects. The smile never reached his dark eyes, though. They remained as cold as death. "My duty to you is my pleasure, my queen." Captain Mellar led another sortie without orders yesterday, Birgitta said in a even voice. This time the fighting almost spilled into the Farmatting gate, which he had ordered left open against his return. Elaine felt herself feeling hard. Oh no, Sarita protested. It wasn't like that at all. 100 of Lord Luan's armsmen tried to reach the city in the night, but they left it too late, and sunrise caught them. So did 3 times their number of Lord Nason's men. If Captain Mellar hadn't opened the gates and led a rescue, they'd have been cut to pieces inside of the walls. As it was, he managed to save 80 for your cause. Smiling, Mellar basked in the Aes Sedai's praise as if he had not heard Birgitta's criticism. Of course, he seemed unaware of Cariana and Marilla's disapproving stares, too. He always managed to ignore disapproval. How did you know they were Lord Luan's men, Captain? Elaine asked quietly. A small smile that should have given Mellar warning appeared on Birgitta's face. But then he was one of those who seemed not to believe she was a warder. Even if he did, few except warders and Aes Sedai knew what the bond entailed. If anything, Mellar's expression grew more smug. I didn't go by banners, my queen. Anybody can carry a banner. I recognized Jurad Akan through my looking glass. Akan is Luan's man to his toenails. Once I knew that, he made a dismissive gesture in a flurry of lace. The rest was no more than taking a little exercise. And did this Jurad Akan bring any message from Lord Luan? Giving signed and sealed, affirming House Norwelling's support for Trakand? Nothing in writing, my queen, but as I said, Lord Luan has not declared for me, Captain. Mellar's smile faded somewhat. He was unused to being cut short. But, my queen, Lady Dylan says that Luan is as good as in your camp right now. Akan showing up is proof of nothing, Captain, Elaine said coldly. Perhaps Lord Luan will be in my camp eventually, Captain, but until he declares, you've given me 80 men who need to be watched. 80 out of 100. And how many of hers had he lost? And he had risked Cainlan doing it, burning him. Since you can find time in your duties commanding my bodyguard to lead sorties, you can find time to arrange for watching them. I won't spare anyone from the walls for it. Set Master Akan and his fellows to drilling the men I've brought in from the manors. That will keep them all busy and out of trouble most of each day, but I leave it to you how to keep them away from the walls the rest of the time. And I do expect them kept away from the walls and out of trouble, Captain. You may see to it now. Mellar stared at her stunned. She had never taken him to task before, and he did not like it, particularly in front of so many witnesses. There were no overwarm smiles now. His mouth twitched, and a sullen heat grew in his eyes. But there was nothing for him to do except to jerk another bow, murmur, as my queen commands, in a hoarse voice, and leave with as good a grace as he could muster. Before he had gone 3 paces, he was striding down the hall as if to trample anyone who got in his way. She would have to tell Rosaria to take care. He might try to soothe his bile by taking it out on those who had seen and heard. Marililla and Cariana gave almost identical nods. They would have seen Mellar called down and preferably put out of the palace long since. Even if he did wrong, Sarita said carefully, and I'm not convinced that he did. Captain Mellar saved your life, at risk to his own, Elaine, your life and that of the Lady Dylan. Was there really need to embarrass him in front of the rest of us? Never think I avoid paying my debts, Sarita. Elaine felt Avienda grip one of her hands and Birgitta the other. She gave each of them a squeeze. When you were surrounded by enemies, it was good to have a sister and a friend close by.
Give me 1 second, I'll be right back,
I'm
and then we'll
going
do
to find a
that.
hot bath now, and unless one of you wishes to scrub my back. They could recognize a dismissal, and they departed more gracefully than Captain Mellar, Cariana and Sarita already discussing whether or not the Windfinders would actually want lessons today, Marililla trying to look every direction at once, in hope of avoiding any Windfinders. What would they talk of later, though? Whether Elaine was having a spat with the father of her child? Whether they had successfully hidden their guilt in killing Adelius? I always pay my debts, Elaine thought, watching them go, and I help my friends pay theirs. Chapter 12. A Bargain. A bath was not hard to find, though Elaine had to wait in the hall frowning at the lion-carved doors of her apartments, drafts flickering the mirrored stand lamps, while Rosaria and two of the guardswomen went in to search. Once they were sure there were no assassins lying in wait, and guards had been arrayed in the corridor and outer room, Elaine entered to find white-haired Asanda waiting in the bedchamber with Naris and Stephanie, the two young tirewomen she was training. Asanda was slim, with Elaine's golden lily embroidered over her left breast, and a very great dignity emphasized by her deliberate way of moving, though some of that came from age and aching joints she refused to acknowledge. Naris and Stephanie were sisters, fresh-faced, sturdy, and shy-eyed, proud of their livery and happy to have been chosen out for this rather than cleaning hallways, but almost as much in awe of Asanda as of Elaine. There were more experienced maids available, women who had worked years in the palace, but sadly, girls who had come seeking any sort of work they could find were safer. Two copper bathtubs sat on thick layers of toweling laid atop the rose-colored floor tiles where one of the carpets had been rolled up, evidence that word of Elaine's arrival had flown ahead of her. Servants had a knack for learning what was happening that the tower's eyes and ears might envy. A good blaze in the fireplace and tight casements in the windows made the room warm after the corridors, and Asanda waited only to see Elaine enter the room before sending Stephanie off at a run to fetch the men with the hot water. That would be brought up in double-walled pails with lids to keep it from getting cold on the way from the kitchens, though it might be delayed a little by guardswomen checking to make sure there were no knives hidden in the water. Avienda eyed the second bathtub almost as doubtfully as Asanda eyed their visitor, the one still uneasy about actually stepping into water, and the other still not accepting that anyone more than necessary should be present during a bath. But the white-haired woman wasted no time before quietly bustling Elaine and Avienda both into the dressing room, where another fire on a wide marble hearth had taken the chill from the air. It was a great relief to have Asanda to help her out of her riding clothes, knowing that she had more ahead of her than a hasty wash and a show of ease, while worrying about how quickly she could move on to her next destination. Other pretenses awaited the light helper, and other worries, but she was home, and that counted for much. She could almost forget about that beacon shining in the west. Almost. Well, not at all, really, but she could manage to stop fretting over it as long as she did not dwell on the thing. By the time they had been undressed, with Alinda slapping Naris's hands away and removing her own jewelry, doing her best to pretend that Naris did not exist, and her garments were somehow removing themselves. By the time they had been bundled into embroidered silk robes and had their hair tied up in white toweling, Avienda tried to wrap the towel around her own head 3 times, and only after the construction collapsed down her neck for the 3rd time did she allow Naris to do it, muttering about getting so soft that she soon would need someone to lace up her boots, until Elaine began laughing and she joined in, throwing her head back so that Naris had to start over again. By the time all that was done, and they had returned to the bedchamber, the bathtub was full, and the scent of the rose oil that had been added to the water filled the air. The men who had brought up the water were gone, of course, and Stephanie was waiting with her sleeves pushed above her elbows in case someone wanted her back scrub. Birgitta was sitting on the inlaid chest at the foot of the bed, her elbows on her knees. Elaine allowed Asanda to help her off with her pale green swallow-worked robe and sank into her tub immediately, submerging herself to her neck in water just a hair short of too hot. That left her knees poking up, but it immersed most of her in the warmth, and she sighed, feeling weariness leach out of her and languor creep in. Hot water might have been the greatest single gift of civilization. Staring at the other tub, Avienda gave a start when Naris attempted to remove her robe, lavender and embroidered with flowers on the wide sleeves. Grimacing, she finally allowed it and stepped gingerly into the water, but she snatched the round soap out of Stephanie's hand and began washing herself vigorously, but very careful not to slop so much as a spoonful of water over the tub's rim. The Aiel did use water for washing, as well as in the sweat tents, especially for rinsing out the
Hell yeah.
shampoo they made from a fat leaf that grew in the waste. Yet the
I got
dirty
one
water
already
was
rolling.
conserved and used for watering crops. Elaine had shown her 2 of the great cisterns beneath Camelin, fed by a pair of underground rivers, and large enough that the far side of each was lost in a forest of thick columns and shadows. But the arid waste was in Avienda's bones. Ignoring Asanda's pointed looks, she seldom said 2 words more than necessary, and thought baths no time to say anything. Birgitta talked while they bathed, though she took care of what she said in front of Nerys and Stephanie. It was unlikely they were in the pay of another house, but maids gossiped almost as freely as men. It seemed almost a tradition. Some rumors were worth fostering, nonetheless. Mostly Birgitta talked of 2 huge merchants' trains that had arrived yesterday from Tyr, the wagons heavy with grain and salted beef, and another from Ilion with oil and salt and smoked fish. It was always worthwhile reminding people that food continued to flow into the city. Few merchants braved the roads of Andor in winter, none carrying anything as cheap as food. But gateways meant that Aranella could intercept all the merchants she wished, and her forces still would starve long before Camelin felt the first pangs of hunger. The Windfinders, who were making most of those gateways, reported that the High Lord Darlin, claiming the title of steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn of all things, was besieged in the Stone of Tyr by nobles who wanted the Dragon Reborn out of Tyr completely. But even they were unlikely to try stopping a rich trade in grain, particularly since they believed the kin who accompanied the Windfinders were Aes Sedai. Not that any real attempt was made at deception, but great serpent rings had been made for kinswomen who had passed their tests or accepted before being put out of the tower, and if anyone drew the wrong conclusion, no one actually lied to them. The water was going to shed its heat if she waited much longer, Elaine decided, so she took a rose-scented soap from Stephanie and allowed Nerys to begin scrubbing her back with a long-handled brush. If there had been news of Gawain or Galad, Birgitta would have mentioned it straight off. She was as eager to hear as Elaine, and she could not have held it back. Gawain's return was one rumor that dearly wanted to reach the streets. Birgitta performed her duties well as Captain General, and Elaine meant her to keep the position if she could be convinced. But having Gawain there would allow both women to relax a little. Most of the soldiers in the city were mercenaries, and only enough of them to man the gates strongly and make a display along the miles of wall surrounding the new city, but they still numbered more than 30 companies, each with its own captain, who inevitably was full of pride, obsessed with precedence, and ready to squabble over any imagined slight from another captain at the drop of a straw. Gawain had trained his whole life to command armies. He could deal with the squabblers, leaving her free to secure the throne. Apart from that, she simply wanted him away from the White Tower. She prayed that one of her messengers had gotten through and that he was well downriver by this time. Egwene had been besieging Tar Valon with her army for more than a week now, and it would be the cruelest spinning of fate for Gawain to be caught between his oath to defend the tower and his love for Egwene. Of course, he had already broken that oath once, or at least spent it, for love of his sister, and perhaps his love of Egwene. If Elida ever suggested that Gawain had aided Swan's escape, whatever credit he had gained by helping her replace Swan as Amerlin would evaporate like a dewdrop. And if he was still within Elida's reach when she learned, he would find himself in a cell, and lucky to avoid the headsman. Elaine did not resent his decision to aid Elida. He could not have known enough then to make any other choice. A good many sisters had been confused over what was happening, too. A good many still seemed to be. How could she ask Gawain to see what Aes Sedai could not? As for Galad, she had grown up unable to like the man. Sure, he must resent her, and resent Gawain most of all. Galad had to have thought he would be first prince of the sword one day, until Gawain was born. Her earliest memories of him were of a boy, a young man, already behaving more like a father or uncle than a brother, giving Gawain his first lessons with a sword. She remembered being afraid he would break open Gawain's head with a practice blade. But he had never given more than the bruises any youth expected in learning swords. He knew what was right, Galad did, and he was willing to do what was right no matter the cost to anyone, including himself. Light, he had started a war to help her and Nynaeve escape from Samara, and it was likely he had known the risk from the start. Galad fancied Nynaeve, or had for a time. It was hard to imagine he still felt that way, with him a white cloak, but Light only knew where and doing what. But the truth was he had started that war to rescue his sister. She could not condone him being a child of the light. She could not like him, yet she hoped that he was safe and well. She hoped he found his way home to Camelin, too. News of him would have been nearly as welcome as news of Gawain. That surprised her, but it was true. Two more sisters came while you were away. They're at the Silver Swan. Birgitta made it sound as though they were merely stopping at an inn, because every bed in the palace was taken. A green with 2 warders and a gray with 1. They came separately. A yellow and a brown left the same day, so there are still 10 altogether. The yellow went south toward Farmatic. The brown was heading east. Stephanie, waiting patiently beside Avienda's tub with nothing to do, exchanged a glance with her sister over Elaine's head and grinned. Like many in the city, they knew for a fact that the presence of Aes Sedai at the Silver Swan signified White Tower support for Elaine and House Tracan. Watching the 2 girls like a hawk, Esenda nodded. She knew it too. Every street sweeper and rag picker was aware that the tower was divided against itself. But even so, the name still carried weight, and an image of strength that never failed. Everyone knew the White Tower had lent support to every rightful queen of Andor. In truth, most sisters looked forward to a sitting monarch who was also Aes Sedai, the first in 1,000 years, and the first since the breaking of the world to be openly known as Aes Sedai. But Elaine would not be surprised to find there was a sister in Aramilla's camp, keeping discreetly out of notice. The White Tower never placed all of its coin on one horse unless the race was fixed. "That's enough of the brush," she said, irritably twisting away from the bristles. Well trained, the girl laid the brush down on a stool and handed her a large Ilianer sponge that she used to begin sluicing off soap. She wished she knew what those sisters meant. They were like a grain of sand in her slipper, so tiny a thing that you could hardly imagine it being a discomfort, but the longer it remained, the larger it seemed. The sisters at the Silver Swan were becoming a sizable stone just by being there. Since before she arrived in Camelin, the number at the inn had been changed frequently, a few sisters leaving every week and a few coming to replace them. The siege had not changed anything. The soldiers surrounding Camelin were no more likely to try stopping an Aes Sedai from going where she wanted than were the rebellious nobles in Tyr. There had been reds in the city, too, for a while, asking after men heading for the Black Tower, but the more they learned, the more they had let their disgruntlement show, and the last pair had ridden out of the city the day after Aramilla appeared before the walls. Every Aes Sedai who entered the city was carefully watched, and none of the Reds had gone near the Silver Swan, so it seemed unlikely the sisters there had been sent by Elaida to kidnap her. For some reason she imagined little groups of Aes Sedai scattered from the Blight to the Sea of Storms, and constant streams of sisters flowing between, gathering information, sharing information. A peculiar thought. Sisters used eyes and ears to watch the world, and rarely shared what they learned unless it was a threat to the tower itself. Likely those of the Swan were among the sisters sitting out the tower's troubles, waiting to see whether Egwene or Elaida would end with the Amerlin seat before they declared themselves. That was wrong. An Aes Sedai should stand for what she thought was right without worrying over whether she was choosing the winning side. But these made her uneasy for another reason. Recently, one of her watchers at the Swan had overheard a disturbing name, murmured and quickly shushed. as if in fear of eavesdroppers. Catswain. Not a common name, that. And Catswain Malydrin had meshed herself closely with Rand while he was in Kyrian. Van Deen did not think much of the woman, calling her opinionated and mule-headed, but Cariana had almost fainted in awe at hearing her name. It seemed the stories surrounding Catswain amounted to legends. Trying to deal with the dragon reborn single-handed was just the sort of thing Catswain Malydrin might do. Not that Elaine had concerns about Rand and any Aes Sedai, except that he might outrage her beyond her control. The man was too pig-headed himself sometimes to see where his own good lay. But why would a sister in Caelin mention her name? And why had another hushed her?
Right back.
Despite the hot bath water, she shivered, thinking of all the webs the White Tower had spun through the centuries, so fine that none could see them except the sisters who did the spinning, so convoluted that none but those sisters could have unraveled them. The tower spun webs, the Ajas spun webs, even individual sisters spun webs. Sometimes those schemes blended into one another as though guided by a single hand. Other times they had pulled one another apart. That was how the world had been shaped for 3,000 years. Now the tower had divided itself neatly into rough thirds. 1/3 for Egwene, one for Elida, and one that was standing aside. If those last were in contact with one another, exchanging information, forming plans, the implications... A sudden tumult of voices dimmed by the closed door made her sit up straight. Naris and Stephanie squealed and leaped to clutch one another, staring wide-eyed at the door. What in the bloody flaming... Snarling, Birgitta hurled herself off the chest and out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The voices rose higher. It did not sound as if the guardswomen were fighting, just arguing at the tops of their lungs, and the bond carried mainly anger and frustration, along with her bloody headache. But Elaine climbed out of the bathtub, holding out her arms for Asunda to slip her robe on. The white-haired woman's calmness, and perhaps Elaine's, soothed the two maids enough that they blushed when Asunda looked at them. But Avienda leaped from her tub, splashing water everywhere, and dashed dripping into the dressing room. Elaine expected her to return with her belt knife, but instead she came back surrounded by the glow of Saidar and holding the amber turtle in one hand. With the other she handed Elaine the angreal that had been in her belt pouch, an aged ivory carving of a woman clothed only in her hair. Excepting the towel atop her head, Avienda wore only a wet sheen, and she angrily waved Stephanie away when the woman tried to put her robe on her. Knife or no knife, Avienda still tended to with a blade, and might need to move suddenly. Put this back in the dressing room, Elaine said, handing the ivory angreal to Asunda. Avienda, I really don't think we need to... The door opened a crack, and Birgitta put her head in, scowling. Naris and Stephanie jumped, not so soothed as they had seemed. Zaida wants to see you, Birgitta growled at Elaine. I told her she'd have to wait, but with a sudden yelp, she staggered into the room, catching her balance after 2 steps, and whirling to face the woman who had pushed her. The wave mistress of Clan Catalar did not look as though she had pushed anyone. The ends of her intricately knotted red sash swirling about her knees, she entered the room calmly, followed by 2 windfinders, one of whom shut the door in Rasoria's angry face. All 3 swayed when they moved nearly as much as Birgitta did in her heeled boots. Zaida was short, with streaks of gray in her tightly curled hair, but her dark face was one of those that grew more beautiful with the years, and her beauty only seemed magnified by the golden chain, heavy with small medallions, that connected one of her fat golden earrings to her nose ring. More importantly, her air was one of command, not of arrogance, but of the knowledge that she would be obeyed. The windfinders eyed Avienda, still glowing with the power, and Shanella's angular face tightened. Yet, aside from a murmur from Shialin that the Aiel girl was ready to leave, they remained silent and waited. The 8 earrings in Shyalin's ears marked her as windfinder to a clan wave mistress, and Shanella's honor chain carried nearly as many golden medallions as that of Zaida herself. Both were women of authority, and it was plain in the way they held themselves and moved, yet one needed to know nothing of the Atha Amir to know as soon as one saw them that Zaida din Parida held the first
That
spot.
one's down.
Your boots must have fit you, Captain General, she murmured with a small smile on her full lips, one dark tattooed hand toying with the golden scent box that dangled on her chest. Clumsy things, boots. She and the two windfinders were barefoot as always. The soles of the Atha Amir's feet were as tough as shoe soles, unbothered by rough decks or cold floor tiles. Strangely, in addition to their blouses and trousers of brightly colored silk brocades, each woman wore a wide stole of plain white that hung below her waist and almost hid her multitude of necklaces. I was taking a bath, Elaine said in a tight voice, as if they could not see that, with her hair done up and her robe clinging to her damply. Esanda was almost quivering with indignation, which meant she must be beside herself with fury. Elaine felt close to it herself. I will be taking a bath again as soon as you go. I will speak with you when I have finished taking my bath, if it pleases the light. There. If they were going to shove into her rooms, let them chew on that for ceremony. The grace of the light be upon you also, Elaine, said I, Zaida replied smoothly. She raised an eyebrow at Avienda, though neither at the continuing light of Saidar, since Zaida could not channel, nor at her nudity, since the sea folk were quite casual about that, at least out of sight of landmen. You have never invited me to bathe with you, though it would have been courteous, but we will not speak of that. I have learned that Nestadin Rias Tumruz is dead, killed by the Shonshan. We mourn her loss. All three women touched their white stoles and touched fingertips to lips, yet Zaida seemed as impatient with formality as Elaine. Without raising her voice or speeding its pace, she merely pushed on, almost shockingly abrupt and to the point for one of the sea folk. The first 12 of the Atha Amir must meet to choose another mistress of the ships. What is happening to the west makes it clear there can be no delay. Shailen's mouth tightened, and Chanella raised her pierced scent box to her nose, as if to drown the smell of something. Its spicy perfume was sharp enough to slice through the scent of rose oil in the room.
Out now.
However they had described what they sensed to Zaida, she displayed no unease, or anything but certainty. Her gaze held steady on Elaine's face. We must be ready for whatever comes, and for that we need a mistress of the ships. In the name of the White Tower, you promised 20 teachers. I cannot take Van Dien in her grief or you, but I will take the other 3 with me. The rest the White Tower owes, and I will expect prompt payment. I have sent to the Sisters of the Silver Swan to see whether some of them will meet the tower's debt, but I cannot wait on their reply. If it pleases the light, I will bathe with the other wave mistresses tonight at the harbor of Ilion. Elaine fought very hard to keep her own face smooth. The woman just announced that she intended to scoop up every Aes Sedai lying around loose in Camelin and carry them off, and it sounded very much as if she did not intend to leave any of the wave-finders behind. That made Elaine's heart sink. Until Rihanna returned, there were 7 of the kin with sufficient strength to weave a gateway, but 2 of those could not make one large enough to admit a horse cart. Without the Windfinders, plans for keeping Camelin supplied from Tyr and Ilion became problematical at best. The Silver Swan. Light. Whoever Zaida had sent would reveal every line of the bargain she had made. Egwene was not going to thank her for spilling that mess out into the open. She did not think she had ever had so many problems dropped in her lap in the course of one short statement. I regret your loss and the Atha Amir's loss, she said, thinking fast. Nesta Din Reis was a great woman. She had been a powerful woman anyway, and a very strong personality. Elaine had felt happy to walk away with more than her shift after her one meeting with her. Speaking of shifts, she could not afford time to dress. Zaida might not wait. She belted her robe tighter. We must talk. Have wine brought for our guests, Esanda, and tea for me. Weak tea, she sighed at a burst of caution through the bonds to Birgitta. In the smaller sitting room. Will you join me, Wave Mistress? To her surprise, Zaida merely nodded as if she had expected this. That started Elaine thinking about Zaida's side of the bargain between them. The bargains. There were two, really. And that might be a key point. No one had expected the smaller sitting room to be used for some time, so the air held a chill, even after Stephanie rushed with a spark wheel to light the kindling laid beneath split oak on the wide white hearth and scurried out of the room. Flames leapt up from the fat wood, catching on the log atop the fire irons as the women arrayed themselves in the lightly carved, low-backed chairs, arranged in a semicircle in front of the fireplace. Well, Elaine and the Seafolk women arrayed themselves, Elaine arranging her robe carefully over her knees, and wishing Zaida had delayed just an hour so she could be properly dressed, the Windfinders coolly waiting for the wave mistress to take a chair, then sitting to either side of her. Birgitta stood in front of the writing table with her hands on her hips and her feet apart, her face a thunderhead. The bond carried a clear desire to wring an Ata-Amnier neck. Avienda leaned casually against one of the sideboards, and even when Asanda brought her robe and pointedly held it out for her, she merely put it on and resumed her pose with her arms folded beneath her breasts. She had released Sidar, but the turtle was still in her hand, and Elaine suspected she was ready to embrace the power again in an instant. Neither Avienda's cold, green-eyed stare nor Birgitta's scowl affected the Seafolk in the least, however. They were who they were, and they knew who they were. The Ata-Amnier were promised 20 teachers, Elaine said, emphasizing slightly. Zaida had said that she had been promised, that she would collect payment. But that bargain had been made with nested-in weeks. Of course, Zaida might believe she would become the new mistress of the ships herself. Proper teachers to be selected by the Amerlin seat. I know that the Ata-Amnier pride themselves on meeting their bargains in full, and the tower will meet its side too. But you knew when sisters here agreed to teach that it was temporary, and a bargain quite apart from that made with the mistress of the ships. You admitted as much when you agreed for Windfinders to weave gateways to bring supplies to Camelin from Ilion and Tyr. Surely you would not have gotten involved in the affairs of the shorebound for any reason other than paying off a bargain. But if you are leaving, your help is at an end, and so is our requirement to teach. I fear you will harvest no teachers at the Silver Swan, either. The Ata-Amnier will have to wait until the Amerlin sends teachers, according to the bargain made with the mistress of the ships. A pity she could not demand they stay away from the inn, but it might already be too late for that, and every reason she could think of sounded hollow. An argument that shattered for lack of a center would only embolden Zaida. The Ata-Amnier were ferocious hagglers, scrupulous but ferocious. She had to go very slowly, very carefully. My sister has you by the ear, Zaida din Parida, Avienda chortled, slapping her thigh. Hung up by the ankles, in fact. That was a Seafolk punishment that she found incredibly amusing for some reason. Elaine stifled a burst of irritation. Avienda enjoyed chances to tweak the Seafolk's noses. She'd begun while they were fleeing Ebu Dar and never really stopped. This was no time for it. Chanella stiffened, her calm face sinking into a glare. The lean woman had been the butt of Avienda's nose-tweaking more than once, including a regrettable episode involving usquai, a very potent Aiel drink. The glow of Sidar actually surrounded her. Zaida could not see that, but she knew about the usquai and Chanella being carried to her bed, sicking up the whole way, and she raised a peremptory hand toward the Windfinder. The glow faded, and Chanella's face darkened. It might have been a blush or anger. All that you say may be so, Zaida said, which was not far from insulting, especially said to an Aes Sedai. In any event, Merililla was not part of that. She agreed to be one of the teachers long before she reached Camelin, and she will go with me to continue her teaching. Elaine drew a long breath. She could not even try to argue Zaida out of this. A great part of the White Tower's influence rested on the fact that the tower kept its word as surely as the Seafolk, that it was known to keep its word. Old people say I had to listen carefully to be sure, and I said I had promised what you thought she had, and that was often true. But once the promise was clear, it was as good as an oath under the light. At least the Windfinders were not likely to let Marililla get away. They hardly let her out of their sight. You may have to return her to me if I have particular need of her. If Van Deen and the two helpers found proof that she was Black Archer. If that happens, I will arrange a replacement. And who that could be, she had no idea. She has the rest of her year to serve. At least a year, by the bargain. Zaida gestured as if making a concession. But so long as you understand that her replacement must come before she leaves, I will not let her go without another in her place. I suppose that will do, Elaine replied calmly. It would bloody well have to, since she had no other choice. Zaida smiled faintly and let the silence stretch. Chanella shifted her feet, but more in impatience than as if to rise, and the wave mistress did not stir. Plainly she wanted something more, intended another bargain, and plainly she wanted Elaine to speak first. Elaine set herself to outwait the other woman. The fire had begun to blaze and crackle, sending sparks up the chimney and radiating a fine warmth into the room, but her damp robe absorbed the chill in the air and transferred it to her skin. Ignoring the cold was all very well, but how were you supposed to ignore being cold and wet? She met Zaida's gaze levelly and matched her tiny smile.
I'll be
Esanda
right
returned,
back.
followed by Nara and Stephanie, carrying ropework trays, the one with a silver teapot in the shape of a lion and thin green cups of sea-folk porcelain, the other hammered silver cups, and a tall-necked wine pitcher that gave off the aroma of spices. Everyone took wine, except for Elaine, who was never offered the choice. Peering into her tea, she sighed. She could see the bottom of the cup quite clearly. If they made it any weaker, they might as well give her water. After a moment, Avienda strode across the room to set her wine cup back on the tray atop one of the sideboards and pour herself a cup of tea. She gave Elaine a nod and a smile, combining sympathy with the suggestion that she really preferred watery tea to wine. Elaine smiled back in spite of herself. First sisters shared the bad as well as the good. Birgitta grinned over the top of her silver cup and proceeded to empty half of it in a gulp. The bond carried her amusement at the grumpiness she felt from Elaine, and it still carried her headache, in no way reduced. Elaine rubbed her temple. She should have insisted that Marililla heal the woman as soon as she had seen her. A number of the kin outstripped Marililla when it came to healing, but she was the only sister in the palace with a halfway decent ability. You have great need of women to make these gateways, Zaida said suddenly. Her full mouth was no longer smiling. She disliked having spoken first. Elaine sipped her wretched excuse for tea and said nothing. It might please the light that I could leave one or two windfinders here, Zaida went on,
Ah, shit.
for a set time.
Give me a second. I forgot something.
Elaine wrinkled her brow as though considering. She needed those bloody women and more than one or two. What would you ask in return? She said finally. 1 square mile of land on the river Aranon. Good land, mind, not marshy or boggy. It is to be Apa-Anier land in perpetuity. Under our laws, not Andor's, she added, as if that were a small afterthought, hardly worth mentioning. Elaine choked on her tea. The Apa-Anier hated leaving the sea, hated being out of sight of it, and Zaida was asking for land 1,000 miles from the nearest salt water, asking for it to be ceded absolutely at that. Kyrianan and Neurandians and even Altarans had bled trying to take bits of Andor, and Andorans had bled to keep them out. Still, 1 square mile was a small bit, and a small price to keep Camelin supplied. Not that she would let Zaida know that. And if the sea folk began trading directly into Andor, then Andoran goods would be able to move in sea folk bottoms everywhere the sea folk sailed, and that was everywhere. Zaida surely knew that already, but there was no point in letting her know that Elaine had thought of it. The warder bond urged caution, yet there were times for boldness, as Birgitta should know better than anyone. Sometimes tea goes down the wrong way. Not a lie, merely an evasion. For a square mile of Andorra, I deserve more than 2 wind-finders. The Upper Anmier got 20 teachers and more for help using the Bowl of the Winds, and when they go, you will have 20 to replace them. You have 21 wind-finders with you. For a mile of Andorra, I should have all 21, and 21 more in their places when they leave, for as long as Aes Sedai teach seafolk. Best not to let the woman think that was her way of rejecting the offer out of hand. Of course, the normal customs duties would apply to any goods moving off this land into Andorra. Zaida raised her silver cup to her mouth, and when she lowered it, she wore the tiniest smile. Yet Elaine thought it was a smile of relief rather than triumph. Goods moving into Andor, but not goods coming from the river onto our land. I might leave 3 windfinders, for half a year, say, and they must not be used in fighting. I will not have my people die for you, and I will not have other Andorans angry at us because seafolk have killed some of them. They will be asked only to make gateways, Elaine said, though they must make them wherever I require. Light, as if she intended using their one power as a weapon. The seafolk did so without a second thought, but she was trying very hard to behave as Egwene demanded, as though she had already taken the 3 oaths. Besides, if she blasted those camps outside the walls with Sidar, or allowed anyone else to, not a house in Andor would stand with her. They must stay until my crown is secure, whether that is half a year or longer. The crown should be hers in much less time, but as her old nurse Lini used to say, you counted your plums in the basket, not on the tree. Once the crown was hers, though, she would not need windfinders to supply the city, and in all truth, she would be happy to see their backs. But 3 is not nearly enough. You will want Shailin, since she is your windfinder. I will keep the rest. The medallions on Zaida's honor chain swayed gently as she shook her head. Talan and Matara are apprentices still. They must return to their training. The others have duties too. 4 might be spared until your crown is secure. From there, it was just a matter of bargaining. Elaine had never expected to keep the apprentices, and windfinders to clan wave mistresses could not be spared either, which she had expected. Most wave mistresses used their windfinders and swordmasters as close advisors, and would be parted from one as easily as she would be parted from Birgitta. Zaida tried to exclude others as well, such as windfinders who served on large vessels like rakers and skimmers, but that would have disqualified the greater number right there, and Elaine refused to come down in her demands unless Zaida came up in her offers, which the woman did slowly, grudging every concession, but not so slowly as Elaine might have expected. Clearly the wave mistress needed this bargain as much as she herself needed women who could weave gateways. Under the light, it is agreed, she was able to say at last, kissing the fingertips of her right hand and leaning forward to press them to Zaida's lips. Avienda grinned, obviously impressed. Birgitta kept a smooth face, but the Bond said she found it hard to believe Elaine had come out so well. It is agreed under the light, Zaida murmured. Her fingers on Elaine's lips were hard and calloused, though she could not have hauled on a rope herself in many years. She looked quite satisfied for a woman who had yielded 9 of the 14 windfinders who had been on the table. Elaine wondered how many of those 9 would be women whose ships had been destroyed by the Shonchan in Ebu Dar. Losing a ship was a serious matter among the Afa Anmier, whatever the reason, and maybe cause enough to want to stay away from home a little longer. No matter. Chanella looked glum, her tattooed hands tight on the knees of her red brocaded trousers, yet not so glum as might be expected from a seafolk woman who would have to remain ashore a while longer. She was to command the windfinders who stayed, and she did not like it that Zaida had acceded to her being under Elaine's authority, and Birgitta's. There were to be no more seafolk striding around the palace as if they owned it, and making demands left and right. But then Elaine suspected that Zaida had come to this meeting knowing she would leave some of her party behind, and Chanella had come knowing she would command them. That hardly mattered either. Nor did it matter what advantage Zaida hoped to gain toward becoming mistress of the ships. That she saw some was clear as good glass. All that mattered was that Camelin would not go hungry. That and the bloody beacon still blazing in the west. No, she would be a queen, and she could not be a moonstruck girl. Camelin and Andor were all that could matter. Chapter 13. High Seas. Zaida and the two Windfinders departed from Elaine's apartments, graceful and outwardly unhurried, but with almost as little ceremony as they had entered, a bare wish that the light illumine Elaine and see her safe. For Arthur Anmier, that was almost rushing off without a word. Elaine decided that if Zaida did indeed want to be the next mistress of the ships, the woman had a rival she hoped to steal a march on. It might be well for Andor if Zaida did attain the Arthur Anmier throne, or whatever the sea folk called it. Bargain or no bargain, she would always be aware that Andor had helped her, and that had to be for the good. Though, if she failed, her rival would be aware of where Andor's favor had gone, too. Still, it was all if and maybe. Here and now was another thing altogether. I do not expect anyone to manhandle an ambassador, she said quietly once the doors had closed behind them. But in the future I do expect the privacy of my rooms. Even ambassadors are not to be allowed simply to wander in. Am I understood? Rasoria nodded, her face wooden, but by the color that flashed into her cheeks, she felt the mortification of having let the sea folk pass as keenly as Birgitta, and the bond writhed until Elaine felt her own face growing red with a stinging embarrassment. You did nothing wrong, exactly, but don't let it happen again. Light. Now she sounded a dolt. We will speak no more of it, she said stiffly. Oh, burn Birgitta and the bond. They would have had to wrestle with Zaida to stop her, but adding bone-deep humiliation to the other woman's headache was piling insult on injury. And Avienda had no call to grin in that smarmy way. Elaine did not know when or how her sister had learned that she and Birgitta sometimes reflected one another, but Avienda found the whole thing vastly amusing. Her sense of humor could be rough at times. I think you two will make each other melt one day, she said, laughing. But then you already played that joke, Birgitta Trahelian. Birgitta scowled at her, sudden alarm, crushing embarrassment in the bond, and she returned such a look of innocence, it seemed her eyes might fall out of her face. Better not to ask, Elaine decided. When you ask questions, Nina used to say, then you have to hear the answers, whether you want to or not. She did not want to hear, not with Rasoria studiously examining the floor tiles in front of her boots, and the rest of the guardswomen in the anteroom failing to pretend not to be listening. She had never realized how precious privacy was until she lost it completely. Near enough completely, anyway. I'm going to finish my bath now, she said calmly. Blood and ashes. What joke had Birgitta played on
cheers.
her? Something that made her melt? It could not have been much if she still did not know what it was. Unfortunately, the bath water had gone cold, tepid, anyway. Hardly anything she wanted to sit in. A little while longer soaking would have been wonderful, but not at the expense of waiting while the tubs were emptied bucket by bucket and more hot water brought up. The entire palace must know she was back by now, and the first maid and the first clerk would be anxious to make their daily reports. Daily when she was in the city, and doubly anxious because she had been gone for a day. Duty came before pleasure if you were going to rule a country, and that went doubly for trying to gain the throne in the first place. Avienda pulled the towel from her head and shook down her hair, appearing relieved that she would not have to climb into water again. She started for the dressing room, shedding her robe before she reached the door, and had donned most of her garments when Elaine and the maids entered. With only a few mutters, she let Naris complete the job, although little remained beyond stepping into her heavy woolen skirt. She slapped the maid's hands away and tightened the laces of her soft knee-high boots herself. For Elaine, it was not so easy. Unless some emergency loomed, Asanda felt slighted when she did not discuss her choice of dresses. With close servants, there was always a delicate balance to maintain. Without exception, a body servant knew more of your secrets than you thought she did, and she saw you at your worst, grumpy, tired, weeping in your pillow, in rages and sulks. Respect had to go both ways, or the situation became impossible. So Avienda was sitting on one of the padded benches, allowing Maris to comb out her hair before Elaine could conclude on a simple gray in fine wool, embroidered in green on the high neck and the sleeves, and trimmed with black fox. It was not so much that she had difficulty deciding, but that Asanda kept putting forward silks sewn with pearls or sapphires or fire drops, each more ornately embroidered than the last. No matter that the throne was not yet hers, Asanda wanted to dress her every day as a queen readying for an audience. There had been a point to that, back when every day brought delegations of merchants to offer petitions or make their respects, especially outlanders hoping the troubles in Andor would not affect their trade. The old saying that who held Cainlin held Andor had never really been true, and in merchant eyes, the chances she would actually gain the throne had diminished with the arrival of Aranella's army outside the gates. They could count the houses arrayed on either side as easily as they could count coin. Even Andoran merchants avoided the royal palace now, keeping out of the inner city as much as possible, so no one would think they had gone to the palace, and bankers came well hooded in anonymous carriages. None wished her ill that she knew, and certainly none wanted to anger her, but neither did they want to anger Aranella, not now. Still, the bankers did come, and so far she had not heard of any merchants presenting petitions to Aranella. That would be the first sign that her cause was lost. Getting into the dress took twice as long as it should have, since Asanda allowed Stephanie to help Elaine. The girl breathed heavily the whole time, unaccustomed as yet to dressing someone else, and fearful of making a mistake under Asanda's eye. Much more than of making one in front of her mistress, Elaine suspected. Apprehension made the sturdy young woman clumsy. Clumsiness made her more painstaking, and taking pains made her worry more about mistakes, so the result was that she moved more slowly than the frail older woman ever had. Finally, however, Elaine found herself seated facing Avienda, letting Asanda draw an ivory comb through her curls. In Asanda's view, allowing one of the girls to slip a shift over Elaine's head or fasten her buttons was one thing, but risking either of them making a tangle in her hair quite another. Before the comb had made 24 strokes, though, Birgitta appeared in the doorway. Asanda sniffed, and Elaine could all but see the woman grimace behind her back. Asanda had given way on Birgitta being present at baths, however reluctantly, but the dressing room was sacrosanct. Surprisingly, Birgitta let the maid's disapproval slide past her without so much as a placating look. Usually she refrained from pushing Asanda an inch further than Elaine required. Dialin has returned, Elaine. She's brought company, the high seats of Mantiar, Haven, Gilliard, and Northern. For some reason, the bond carried streaks of puzzlement and annoyance. Shared headache or no, Elaine could have jumped for joy. If Asanda had not had the comb deep in her hair, she might have. 4. She had never expected Dylan to accomplish so much. Hoped for it, prayed for it, but never expected it. Certainly not in one short week. In truth, she had been sure Dylan would return empty-handed. 4 gave her an equal footing with Aranella. It was galling to think of being on an equal footing with that foolish woman, but truth was truth. Mantiar, Haven, Gilliard, and Northern. Why not Candraid? That was the 5th house Dylan had gone to approach. No. She had 4 more houses, and she was not going to fret over the lack of one. Entertain them in the formal sitting room until I can come, Birgitta. The small sitting room had been sufficient for Zonda. She hoped the wave mistress had not noticed the slight, but 4 high seats required more. And ask the first maid to arrange apartments. Apartments? Light! The Atha Anmier would have to be hurried out of theirs to make room. Until they left, most beds that did not have 2 occupants had 3. I sounded the green silk with the sapphires, I think. And sapphires for my hair, too, the large sapphires. Birgitta left, still feeling puzzled and upset. Why? Surely she could not think she should have left Dylan cooling her heels because of Zyda. Oh, light, now she was feeling puzzled over Birgitta feeling puzzled. If that was allowed to feed on itself, they would both end up dizzy. As the door closed, Asunda moved to the nearest wardrobe wearing a smile that might have been called triumphant. Looking at Avienda, who had motioned Naris and her comb away and was folding a dark gray scarf to tie her hair back, Elaine smiled herself. She needed something to take her out of that spinning loop. Maybe you should wear silks and gems just this once more, Avienda, she said in a gently teasing tone. Dylan won't mind, of course, but the others aren't used to Aiel. They might think I'm entertaining a stable hand. She meant it for a joke. They twitted one another about clothes all the time, and Dylan looked askance at Avienda, whatever she wore. But her sister frowned at the wardrobes lining the wall, then nodded and set the scarf down beside her on the tufted cushion. Just so these high seats will be properly impressed. Do not think I will do this all the time. It is a favor to you. For someone just doing a favor, she pored over the clothes that Asunda pulled out with a great deal of interest, before deciding on a dark blue velvet slashed with green and a silver net to catch her hair. They were her clothes, made for her, but since reaching Camelin she had avoided them as if they were crawling with death's head spiders. Stroking the sleeves, she hesitated as if she might change her mind, but finally she let Naris do up the tiny pearl buttons. She declined Elaine's offer of emeralds that would have suited the gown admirably, keeping her silver snowflake necklace and heavy ivory bracelet, but at the last minute she did pin the amber turtle to her shoulder. You can never tell when it might be needful, she said. Better safe than sorry, Elaine agreed. Those colors look beautiful on you. It was true, but Avienda blushed. Compliment her on how well she shot a bow or how fast she could run, and she took it as no more than her due. But she had difficulty coming to grips with the fact that she was beautiful. That was a part of herself she had managed to ignore till recently. Asunda shook her head in disapproval, unaware that the brooch was an angreal. Amber did not go with blue velvet. Or maybe it was Avienda's horn-hilted knife, which she tucked behind her green velvet belt. The white-haired woman made sure that Elaine wore a small dagger with sapphires on the scabbard and pommel, hanging from a belt of woven gold. Everything had to be just so to gain Asunda's approbation. Brasoria gave a start when Avienda entered the anteroom in her high-necked velvets. The guardswomen had never seen her in anything but Aiel garb before. Avienda scowled as if they had laughed, and gripped her belt knife firmly, but luckily her attention was diverted by a cloth-covered tray sitting on the long side table against the wall. Elaine's midday meal had been delivered while they were dressing. Whisking the blue-striped cloth aside, Avienda tried to interest Elaine in eating, smiling and pointing out how sweet the stew of dried plums would be, and exclaiming over the pieces of pork in the grainy mush. Slivers, they looked like. Brasoria cleared her throat and mentioned that a fire was burning nicely in the apartment's larger sitting room. She would be more than happy to carry the tray in for the Lady Elaine. Everyone tried to make sure Elaine ate properly, however they saw properly, but this was ridiculous. The tray had been sitting there some time. The mush was a congealed mass that would have stuck in the bowl if she turned it upside down. She had the high seats of 4 houses waiting on her, and they had waited long enough. She pointed that out, but offered to let the 2 of them eat, if they were hungry. In fact, she implied that she might insist on them eating. That was enough to make Avienda drop the cloth back over the tray with a shudder, and Brasoria wasted no more time either. It was only a short walk down the icy hallway to the formal sitting room, and the only things that moved, aside from them, were the bright winter wall hangings that stirred in the corridor's drafts. But the guardswomen formed a ring around Elaine and Avienda and kept watch as if they expected Trollocs. It was only with an effort that Elaine convinced Rosaria there was no need to search the sitting room before she entered. The guardswomen served her and obeyed her, but they also were pledged to keep her alive, and they could be as muley over that last duty as Birgitta was over deciding whether she was warder, captain general, or elder sister at any given moment. Likely, following on the heels of the incident with Zaida, Rosaria wanted the lords and ladies waiting inside to surrender their weapons. The threat with the mush might have had its part, too. After a short argument, however, Elaine and Avienda swept in through the wide doorway together, and alone. Elaine's feeling of satisfaction did not last, though. The sitting room was large, meant to accept dozens of people comfortably, a dark-paneled space with layered carpets covering the floor tiles and a horseshoe arch of high-backed chairs in front of a tall fireplace of white marble with fine red veins. Here, important dignitaries could be received with more honor than an audience before the throne because it was more intimate. The blaze dancing along the logs on the hearth had barely had time to take an edge off the chill in the air, but that certainly was not the reason Elaine felt as if she had been struck in the stomach. She understood Birgitta's puzzlement now. Dylan turned from warming her hands at the fire as they entered. A strong-faced woman with fine lines at the corners of her eyes and hints of gray in her gold hair, she had not waited to change on reaching the palace, and still wore a riding dress of deep gray that showed a few travel stains on the hem. Her curtsy was the merest bend of her neck, the slightest dip of her knees, but she intended no discourtesy. Dylan knew who she was as surely as Zaida did. Her only jewelry was a small golden pin in the shape of Taravin's owl and oak on her shoulder, a clear statement that the high seat of Taravin needed nothing more. Yet she had almost died to prove her loyalty to Elaine. "My Lady Elaine," she said formally, "it gives me honor to present to you Lord Perival, High Seat of House Mantiar." A pretty golden-haired boy in a plain blue coat jerked away from peering through the four-barreled kaleidoscope on a gilded stand taller than he was. He had a silver cup in his hand that Elaine hoped very much did not contain wine, or at least extremely well watered if it did. One of the side tables held several trays laden with pitchers and cups, and an ornate teapot she knew might as well be filled with water. "My pleasure, my Lady Elaine," he piped, blushing and managing a credible bow, despite a little clumsiness in handling the sword belted to his waist. The weapon looked much too long for him. "House Mantiar stands with House Trakand." She returned his courtesy in a daze, spreading her skirts mechanically. "Lady Catelyn, High Seat of House Haven," Dylan continued. "Elaine?" a dark-eyed young woman at her side murmured, touching her dark green divided skirts and making a fractional dip that might possibly have been intended for a curtsy, though perhaps she just meant to imitate Dylan. Or perhaps she wanted to avoid poking her chin against the large enameled brooch on the high neck of her dress, the blue bear of Haven. Her hair was caught in a silver net worked with the blue bear, too, and she wore a long ring with the sigil as well. A touch too much pride of house, perhaps. Despite her cool haughtiness, she was a woman only by
Hey, Soy,
courtesy,
how you
her
doing?
cheeks still round with baby fat. "Haven stands with Trakand, obviously, or I would not be here." Dylan's mouth tightened slightly, and she gave the girl a hard glance that Catelyn seemed not to see. "Lord Branlet, High Seat of House Gilliard." Another boy, this one with unruly black curls, in green embroidered with gold on the sleeves, who hastily set his wine cup down on a side table as if uneasy at being seen with it. His blue eyes were too big for his face, and he nearly tripped himself with his sword, bowing. "It is my pleasure to say that House Gilliard stands for Trakand, Lady Elaine." Halfway through, his voice broke from treble to bass, and he blushed even harder than Perival. "And Lord Conile, High Seat of House Northern." Conile Northern grinned over the rim of his silver cup. Tall and lean, In a gray coat with sleeves just too short to cover his bony wrists, he had an engaging grin, merry brown eyes, and an eagle's beak for a nose. We drew straws for the order to be introduced, and I drew short. Northen stands with Trakand. Can't let a ninny like Aramilla take the throne. He managed his sword smoothly, and he, at least, had reached his majority. But if he was many months past 16, Elaine would eat his turned-down boots and his silver-knot spurs. Their youth was no surprise, of course, but she had expected Conile to have a graying head at his side to advise him, and the others to have their guardians looking over their shoulders. There was no one else in the room aside from Birgitta, standing in front of the tall, arched windows with her arms folded beneath her breasts. Bright midday sunlight flooding through the clear glass set in the casements made her a silhouette of displeasure. Trakand welcomes all of you, and I welcome all of you, Elaine said, suppressing her dismay. I will not forget your support, and Trakand will not forget. Something of her consternation must have crept through, because Catalin's mouth compressed, and her eyes
glittered. In the
glittered.
hospital parking lot.
I am past my guardianship, as you must know, Elaine, she said in a stiff voice. My uncle, Lord Arundor, said at the Feast of Lights that I was as ready as I would ever be, and might as well have free rein then as in a year. Truth, I think he wanted more time to go hunting while he still can. He has always loved hunting, and he's quite old. Once again she failed to see Diolin's frown. Arundor Haven and Diolin were roughly of an age. I have no guardian either, Branlet said uncertainly, his voice nearly as high-pitched as Catalin's. Diolin gave him a sympathetic smile and smoothed his hair back from his forehead. It promptly fell forward again. Maeve was riding alone, as she liked to do, and her horse stepped into a gopher hole, she explained quietly. By the time anyone found her, it was too late. There has been some discussion over who's to take her place. They've been arguing for 3 months, Branlet muttered. For a moment he looked younger than Perival, a boy trying to find his way with no one to show him the path. I'm not supposed to tell anyone that, but I can tell you. You're going to be the queen. Diolin put a hand on Perival's shoulder, and he stood up straighter, though he still was shorter than she. Lord Willin would be here with Lord Perival, but the years have him bedridden. Age creeps up on us all, eventually. She shot another look at Catalin, but the girl was studying Birgitta now, her lips pursed. Willin said I was to tell you that he sends his good wishes and also one he considers a son. Uncle Willin told me to uphold the honor of Mantiar and of Andor, Perival said, intent as only a child being serious could be. I will try, Elaine. I will try very hard. I'm sure you will succeed, Elaine told him, managing to put at least a little warmth into her tone. She wanted to chase them all out and ask Diolin some very pointed questions, but that could not right away. Whatever their ages, they were all the high seats of powerful houses, and she had to offer refreshment and at least a modicum of conversation before they went to change from their journey. Is she really the Captain General of the Queen's Guards? Catalin asked, as Birgitta handed Elaine a thin blue porcelain cup of slightly darkened hot water. The girl spoke as though Birgitta was not there. Birgitta raised an eyebrow before leaving, but Catalin seemed practiced in not seeing what she did not want to see. The wine cup in her plump hand gave off the sharply sweet aroma of spices. There was not so much as a drop of honey in Elaine's miserable excuse for tea. Yes, and my warder, too, she said.
I'll be right back.
Politely, as ready as she would ever be. The girl probably thought it a compliment. She deserved a switching for pure rudeness, yet you could not switch a high seat, not when you needed her support. Catalin's eyes flashed to Elaine's hands, but the great serpent ring did nothing to alter the coolness of her expression. They gave you that? I had not heard you had been raised Aes Sedai. I thought the White Tower had sent you home when your mother died, or perhaps because of the troubles in the tower we hear about. Imagine Aes Sedai squabbling like farm wives at market. But how can she be a general or a warder without a sword? In any case, my Aunt Evella says a woman should leave swords to men. You don't shoe your own horse when you have a farrier, or grind your own grain when you have a miller. A quote from Lady Evella, no doubt. Elaine schooled her face, ignoring the only slightly buried insults. An army is a general's sword, Catelyn. Gareth Bryn says a general who uses another blade is mistaking the job. The name seemed to make no impression on her either. Miners' children in the mountains of Mist knew Gareth Bryn's name. Avienda appeared at Elaine's side, smiling as though delighted at the opportunity to talk with the girl. Swords are no use at all, she said sweetly. Sweetly, Avienda. Elaine had never realized her sister could dissemble so skillfully. She had a cup of mulled wine, too. It would have been too much to expect her to continue drinking bitter tea out of sisterly affection. You should learn the spear, also the knife, and the bow. Birgitta Trahelian could shoot your eyes out at 200 paces with her bow. Maybe it's 300. The spear? Catelyn said faintly, and then in a slightly incredulous tone, my eyes? You have not met my sister, Elaine said. Avienda, Lady Catelyn Hayden. Catelyn, Avienda of the Nine Valleys Tardant. Perhaps she should have done that the other way around, but Avienda was her sister, and even a high seat must settle for being introduced to the sister of the daughter heir. Avienda is Aiel. She's studying to become a wise one. The fool girl's mouth dropped open at the start, her chin falling more and more with each pronouncement until she was gaping like a fish. Very satisfying. Avienda gave Elaine a smaller smile, her green eyes sparkling with approbation above her wine cup. Elaine kept her own face smooth, but she wanted to grin back. The others were much more easily handled, much less infuriating. Paraval and Branlet were shy their first time in Camelin, much less in the royal palace, hardly saying 2 words unless someone drew them out. Cornile did think the claim that Avienda was Aiel must be a joke, and nearly got her belt knife in his brisket for laughing raucously, but luckily he thought that was a joke as well. Avienda adopted an icy composure that might have made her seem a wise one in her usual clothes. In velvets she appeared even more a lady of the court, no matter how she fingered her knife. And Branlet did keep sneaking sidelong peeks at Birgitta. It took Elaine a little while to realize that he was watching her walk in her heeled boots. Those wide trousers were actually quite snug over the hips, but she only sighed. Fortunately, Birgitta never noticed, and the bond would have let Elaine know even if she tried to hide it. Birgitta liked having men look at her, grown men. It would have done Elaine's cause no good if her warder smacked young Branlet's bottom. Mainly they wanted to know whether Rihanna Corley was an Aes Sedai. None of the 4 had ever seen a sister before, but they thought she must be, since she could channel and carry them and their armsmen across hundreds of miles in a step. It was a good opportunity to practice evasion without actually lying, helped by the great serpent ring on her own finger. A lie would taint her relations with these 4 at the start, but it would hardly do to hope that rumors of Aes Sedai aid would filter out to Aranilla while spreading the truth about freely. Of course, all 4 were eager to know how many armsmen they had brought, a total of just over 3,000, nearly half of them crossbowmen or halberdiers, who would be especially useful on the walls. That was a sizable force for 4 houses to have had ready to hand when Dailen came calling. But then no house wanted its high seat unguarded in these times. Kidnapping was not unheard of when the throne sat in question. Conile said as much, with a laugh. He seemed to find everything worth a laugh. Branlet nodded and scrubbed a hand through his hair. Elaine wondered how many of his numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins knew he was gone, and what they would do when they learned. If Dailen had been willing to wait a few days, Catelyn said, I could have brought more than 1,200 men. That was the third time in as many sentences that she had managed to point out that she had brought the largest contingent by a considerable margin. I have sent to all of the houses pledged to Haven, and I to every house pledged to Northam, Conile added, with a grin, of course. Northam may not summon as many swords as Haven or Trakand, or Mantiar, he put in with a bow to Perival. But whoever rides when the eagles call will be riding for Camelin. They will not ride very fast in winter, Perival said quietly, and astonishingly, since no one had spoken to him. I think that whatever we do, we will have to do it with who we have now. Conile laughed and cuffed the lad's shoulder and told him to buck up his spirits, because every man with a heart was on his way to Camelin to support the Lady Elaine. But Elaine studied Perival more closely. His blue eyes met hers for a moment without blinking before he shyly lowered his gaze. A boy, but he knew what he had written into better than Conile or Catelyn, who proceeded to tell them yet again how many armsmen she had brought, and how many Haven could call on, as if everyone there except Avienda did not know exactly how many rode to each house's summons, in trained soldiers and farmers who had carried a halberd or pike in some war, and village men who could be drafted at need. Close enough to exactly, anyway. Lord Willin had done good work with young Perival. Now she had to keep it from going to waste. Eventually it was time to exchange kisses, with Branlet blushing to his hair and Perival blinking bashfully when Elaine bent to him, and Conile vowing never to wash his cheek. Catelyn returned a surprisingly hesitant peck to Elaine's cheek, as if it had just occurred to her that she had consented to placing Elaine above her. But after a moment she nodded to herself, cool pride settling back on her like a mantle. Once the four were handed over to the maids and serving men who would take them to the apartments that Elaine hoped the first maid had had time to ready, Dialyn refilled her wine cup and settled herself in one of the tall carved chairs with a weary sigh. As fine a week's work as I've ever done, if I do say so myself. I got Candread out of the way straight off. I never thought Danine would be able to make up her mind, and it only took an hour to prove me right, though I had to stay 3 to keep from offending her. The woman must keep in bed till noon from being unable to decide which side of the mattress to climb down from. The rest were ready to see sense with only a little convincing. No one with any sense wants to risk Aramilla gaining the throne. For a moment she frowned at her wine, then fixed Elaine with a steady look. She never hesitated to speak her mind, whether or not she thought Elaine would agree, and plainly she intended to do so now. It may have been a mistake to pass these kinswomen off as Aes Sedai, however side-mouthed we've been about it. The strain may be too much to ask of them, and it puts us all at risk. This morning, for no reason I could make out, Mistress Corley was staring and gaping like a goose girl come to the city. I think she almost failed at weaving the gateway to bring us here. That would have been wonderful. Everyone lined up to ride through a miraculous hole in the air that never materialized, not to mention that it would have stuck me in Catelyn's company for the light knows how long. Odious child. There's a good mind there if someone took her in hand for a few years, but she has a double dose of the viper's even tongue. Elaine gritted her teeth. She knew how cutting Havens could be. The whole family took pride in it. Catelyn obviously did. And she was tired of explaining what on this day could frighten any woman who could channel. She was tired of being reminded of what she was trying to ignore. That bloody beacon was still blazing in the west, an utter impossibility both for its size and its duration. The thing had been unchanging for hours. Anyone who channeled for this long without a rest must have fallen over with exhaustion by now, and Rand Bloody Althor was right there in the heart of it. She was certain of that. He was alive, but that only made her want to slap his face for putting her through this. Well, his face was not there, but Birgitta slammed her silver cup down on a side table so hard that wine flew everywhere. Some laundress was going to sweat to take that stain out of her coat sleeve. A maid would labor for hours to restore the side table's polish. Children, she barked. People are going to die because of the decisions they make, and they're flaming children, Conile worst of all. You heard him, Dylan. He wants to challenge Aramilla's champion like Arthur Bloody Hawkwing. Hawkwing never fought anybody's flaming champion, and he knew when he was younger than Lord Northern that it was a fool's game to rest so much on a flaming duel, but Conile thinks he can win Elaine the flaming throne with his flaming sword. Birgitta Trehillian is right, Avienda said fiercely. Her hands were fists gripping her skirts. Conile Northern is a fool, but how could anyone follow those children into the dance of spears? How could anyone ask them to lead? Dylan regarded them both and chose to answer Avienda first. She was plainly bemused by Avienda's garb, but then she was bemused by Avienda and Elaine adopting one another as sisters, by Elaine having an Aiel friend in the first place. That Elaine chose to include that friend in their councils was something she tolerated, though not without letting her toleration show. I became house seat of Taravin at 15, when my father died in a skirmish on the Altaran marches. My 2 younger brothers died fighting cattle raiders out of Murundi that same year. I listened to advisors, but I told Taravin riders where to strike, and we taught the Altarans and the Murundians to look elsewhere for their thieving. The times choose when children must grow up, Avienda, not we. And in these times, a high seat who is a child cannot be a child any longer. As for you, Lady Birgitta, she went on in a drier voice, your language is, as ever, pungent. She did not ask how Birgitta presumed to know so much of Arthur Hawkwing, things no historian knew, but she studied her appraisingly. Branlet and Perival will take guidance from me, and so will Catelyn, I think, much as I regret the time I'll have to spend with the girl. As for Conile, he's hardly the first young man to think he's invincible and immortal. If you can't keep him reined in as Captain General, I suggest you try walking for him. The way he was eyeing those breeches of yours, he'll follow anywhere you lead. Elaine shrugged off the pure fury welling up in her. Not her fury, any more than it had been her anger at Dylan in the first place, or her anger at Birgitta splashing wine about. It was Birgitta's. She did not want to slap Rand's face. Well, she did, but that was beside the point. Light. Conile had been looking at Birgitta too? They are the high seats of their houses, Avienda. No one in their houses would thank me for treating them as less. Far from it. The men who ride for them will fight to keep them alive, but it is Perival and Branlet, Conile and Catelyn they ride for, not me, because they are the high seats. Avienda frowned and folded her arms as though pulling a shawl around herself, but she nodded. Abruptly and reluctantly, no one rose to such prominence among the Aiel without years of experience and the approval of the wise ones, but she nodded. Birgitta, you will have to deal with them, Captain General to high seat. White hair wouldn't necessarily make them any wiser, and it definitely wouldn't make them any easier to deal with. They'd still have their own opinions, and with years of experience to give them weight, most likely they'd be 10 times as certain they knew what needs to be done better than you do. Or than I do. She made a great effort to keep her tone clear of sharpness, and no doubt Birgitta felt the effort. At least the flow of rage through the bond suddenly diminished. It was only tamped down, not gone. Birgitta enjoyed having men look, at least when she wanted them to look, but she very much did not like anyone saying she was trying to attract their attention. Yet even so, she knew the danger to both of them of letting their emotions run too free. Dylan had begun sipping at her wine, still studying Birgitta. Only a bare handful knew the truth that Birgitta desperately wanted to keep hidden, and Dylan was not among them. Yet Birgitta had been careless enough, a slip of the tongue here, a slip there, that the older woman was certain that some mystery hid behind Birgitta's blue eyes. The light only knew what she would think if she solved that riddle. As it was, the two were oil and water. They could argue over which way was up, and certainly over everything else. This time Dylan clearly thought she had won, foot and horse. Be that as it may, Dialin, Elaine continued, I would have been more pleased if you had brought their advisers with them. What's done is done, but Branlet troubles me in particular. If Gilliard accuses me of kidnapping him, matters become worse than they were, not better. Dialin waved that away. You don't know the Gilliards well, do you? The way they squabble among themselves, they may not notice the boy is gone before summer, and if they do, none will repudiate what he's done. None of them will admit they were so busy in arguing over who's to be his guardian that they forgot to keep an eye on him. And second, none of them will admit they weren't consulted beforehand. In any event, Gilliard would stand for Zaida before standing for Marn, and they don't like Iran or Sarand much better. I hope you're right, Dialin, because I'm appointing you to deal with any angry Gilliards who appear. And while you're advising the other three, you can keep a thumb on Conile so he doesn't do anything completely harebrained. For all her talk, the first suggestion made Dialin wince slightly. The second made her sigh. It made Birgitta laugh out loud. If you have any problems, I'll lend you a pair of breeches and some boots and you can walk for him. Some women, Dialin murmured into her wine, can make a fish bite by crooking a finger, Lady Birgitta. Other women have to drag their bait all over the pond. Avienda laughed at that, but Birgitta's anger began to edge upward in the bond. A wave of cold air swept into the room as the door opened and Rosaria entered, coming to a stiff attention. The first maid and the first clerk have come, my lady, she announced. Her voice faltered at the end as she caught the mood in the room. A blind goat could have caught it, with Dialin smug as a cat in the creamery and Birgitta scowling at her and Avienda both, and Avienda choosing this moment to remember that Birgitta was Birgitta Silverbow, which on this occasion made her stare at the floor, as abashed as if she had been laughing at a wise one. Now and again Elaine wished her friends could all get on as well as she and Avienda did, but somehow they managed to rub on together, and she supposed that was really all she could ask from real people. Perfection was a thing for books and gleemen's stories. Send them in, she told Rosaria, and don't disturb us unless the city is under attack. Unless it is important, she amended. In stories, women who gave orders like that were always setting themselves up for disaster. Sometimes there were lessons in stories, if you looked for them. Chapter 14. What Wise Ones Know. Halwyn Norrie, the first clerk, and Rena Harford, the first maid, entered together, him making a jerky, unpracticed bow, and her a graceful curtsy that was neither too low nor too shallow. They could not have been more different. Mistress Harford was round-faced and regally dignified, her hair in a neat grey bun atop her head. Master Norrie tall and gawky as a wading bird, with his little remaining hair sticking up behind his ears like sprays of white feathers. Each carried an embossed leather folder stuffed with papers, but she held hers at her side as if not to rumple her formal scarlet tabard, unwrinkled as it always seemed to be, no matter the hour or how long she had been on her feet, while he clutched his folder to his narrow chest as if to hide old ink stains, of which several spotted his tabard, including a large blot that made the white lion's tail end in a black tuft. Courtesies done, they immediately put a little distance between them, each not quite watching the other. As soon as the door closed behind Rosaria, the glow of Saidar sprung up around Avienda, and she wove a ward against eavesdropping that clung to the walls of the room. What was said between them was now as safe as they could make it, and Avienda would know if anyone even tried to listen with the power. She was very good with this sort of weave. Mistress Harford, Elaine said, if you will begin. She did not offer wine or seats, of course. Master Norrie would have been shocked to his toenails by such a lapse in the proprieties, and Mistress Harford might well have been offended. As it was, Norrie twitched and glanced sideways at Rena, and her mouth thinned. Even after a week's meetings, their dislike for giving their reports where the other could hear was palpable. They were jealous
One in a
of their
bowl.
fiefs, the more so since the first maid had moved into territory that once might have been considered Master Nari's responsibility. Of course, running the royal palace had always been the first maid's charge, and it might be said that her new duties were only an extension of that. It would not be said by Halwyn Nari, though. The blazing logs settled in the fireplace.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call it into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.